Chapter 6 of The Americans, A New Industrial Age, Part 2. Chapter 6.3 is entitled Big Business and Labor. The main idea of this section is the expansion of industry resulted in the growth of big business and prompted laborers to form unions to better their lives. Chapter 6.3 begins with the story of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie's story is one that represents the American dream. He was born in Scotland and came to this country at age 12 all by himself, and he worked his way up through the Pennsylvania Railroad, ultimately becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world. Andrew Carnegie's success comes from new business strategies that he was the first to use, among these being the idea of vertical integration and horizontal integration. Vertical integration is a process where the business buys out its suppliers. If you're a steel company, for example, the steel company would buy the coal fields and the iron mines, as well as the railroads, in order to control the raw materials and transportation. Horizontal integration is when a company buys out another company that produces a similar product. One steel company might buy out another steel company in order to increase its control over the market. These two types of integration were used by Andrew Carnegie as he began to dominate the American steel industry. And ultimately, Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel Company will produce more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. In the section entitled Social Darwinism and Business, we'll see a recurring theme in American history. Social Darwinism is another example of this attempt to justify the success of a few by the oppression of others. Social Darwinism grew out of Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution. In American history, we have seen the Bible used to justify slavery, discrimination against women, and the extermination of the Indian. Now we're going to see science masquerading as the reason why a very small number of people should be able to oppress a larger number of people. It's a theme that is recurring in American history, in which things that are commonly accepted, like the Bible or science, are used to justify things that should not be accepted, such as the oppression of others for the success and benefit of a few. The reason that social Darwinism worked so well is described here, where it says that the premise of the survival and success of the most capable naturally made sense. However, the theory was also supported by the notion that individual responsibility was the reason why someone would succeed or fail in the American society. This appealed to the Protestant work ethic that many Americans had grown up with. It essentially said that social Darwinism made the rich rich because that was what God wanted. And therefore the poor must be lazy or inferior people who deserved what they got. And this is a feeling that we have today, even though there is overwhelming evidence to suggest that individual effort is not the only requirement for success in the American society. On page 234, you'll see how this growth and consolidation of American business was masterminded by John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller created a large trust corporation, which is a different type of business entity. Instead of doing what Andrew Carnegie did by buying out his competitors, John D. Rockefeller decided it would be easier and cheaper to form what's known as a trust. When two competing or similar companies don't necessarily combine into one new company, they'll create something called a trust. The two companies stay independent, but they're managed by a group of trustees. This way they can share profits but have legally independent powers, so that while they can benefit from each other's cooperation, they can never be held responsible for the actions of the other members of their trust corporation. This also allowed John D. Rockefeller to essentially control all of the oil production in the United States in something called a monopoly. The effect of trust companies like Standard Oil is described here in the section of Rockefeller and the robber barons, where it describes the growth of the Standard Oil Company in the process of just about 10 years. The growth in that time saw Standard Oil starting out with about 3% of all the oil in the country, and within 10 years, through the trust operation, it was able to control 90% of the oil refining business. In response to the gross amount of money that people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were able to create through anti-competitive monopolies in steel and in oil, the government passed what's known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made it illegal to form any trust company that interfered with free trade between states or with other countries. Prosecuting these companies under the Sherman Antitrust Act is one example of how weak the government had become and how it had basically been taken over by the economic power of guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie. Because while the act was passed in 1890, it really wasn't used to break up trusts for another 15 years. The Supreme Court actually sided with the trust companies, throwing out 7 of 8 cases the federal government brought against the trusts. While the government was controlled by these powerful industrialists, they couldn't control the will of the American people. And the growth of labor unions is described here on page 244. The reason that they initially began to organize into unions was because of issues like child labor. Remember, social Darwinism taught them that they were poor because that's what God wanted. They were also told that they were poor because that was as good as they would ever be. Also, the quality of the workplace needed to change as well. Workers worked 12 or more hours a day, 6 days a week, with no vacation, no sick leave, no unemployment compensation, and no compensation if you got hurt while working. Also, children as young as 5 years old were working full-time jobs for almost no money. For example, in 1899, women earned an average of $267 a year, which was just half of the average pay a man received. By contrast, Andrew Carnegie made $23 million in 1899 and paid no income tax. On page 246, you'll read about how organizing under Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor led to improvements in the lives of workers. For example, unionized industries saw their wages rise from $17.50 a week to $24 a week, an increase of almost 30%. Ultimately, industries continued to succeed and grow even though they paid a living wage to their workers. And they also were able to allow their workers to work less. We see under the organization of unions the work week falling from 54 and a half hours a week to just under 49 hours a week. Industrial unions were led by Eugene Debs, who organized the American Railway Union. Within 2 months of his organization, membership climbs from 100 to 150,000 members, making it the largest union in the country. One of the more radically socialist movements in unions was led by the IWW. The IWW was headed up by William Big Bill Hayward. The IWW is also known as the Industrial Workers of the World, and they had a funny nickname. They were called the Wobblies. The growth of labor unions and their calls for better conditions for workers ultimately turns violent when the monopolies and the industrialists refuse to give up even a little bit of their massive profits. And the Great Strike of 1877 is a good example of this. The Ohio Railroad, called the B&O Railroad, struck, and they were ultimately attacked by federal troops. The reason that the federal government got involved was because the railroads were considered to be essential to national security. Imagine, a privately owned and operated business was so essential to the running of a nation that the federal government had to use its own troops upon American citizens. Seeing how the railroads now not only controlled the lawmakers but also the military wing of the federal government, more riots ultimately led to violence. The Homestead Strike is another example of how an industry can be considered so essential to the American government that the government has to kill its own citizens in order to ensure that that privately owned company be allowed to make massive profits off the oppression of the workers. And in this case, it was the Carnegie Steel Company in Pennsylvania, which was struck by its workers who wanted a decent day's wage for a decent day's work. And Andrew Carnegie, that great example of the American dream, called on the federal government to kill these steel workers. In addition to using the federal government and local police, industrialists also called upon private detective agencies, like the Pinkerton detective agencies, to protect their plants. This essentially was a paramilitary vigilante muscle group that would be hired to break the strikers by beating them with axe handles or shooting them with guns. The Pullman Company's strike is detailed here. The Pullman Company, as you'll remember, was famous for building railroad cars, and Pullman himself had built his own town in Illinois to house his workers, basically controlling every aspect of their life. In order to improve the lives of their workers, Eugene Debs was called in to negotiate with the Pullman Company. And the company absolutely refused to negotiate for better wages or decreased rents. And so there was a strike. Then Pullman called upon the federal government, and they called in troops who shot and killed American workers for exercising their First Amendment right to protest. And in addition to that, the federal government threw Eugene Debs into jail for doing nothing more than exercising, again, his First Amendment right to assemble, speak, and protest. This shows now that the federal government will ignore the very basic amendments to the Constitution in favor of industrialized capitalism and the monopoly power of the wealthy. Other unions led by women were the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who led an uprising of over 20,000 seamstresses in 1909. This was in response to the Triangle Shirtwaist fire in New York City. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City produced men's shirts in one of the new skyscrapers that had been built in the city. However, because they wanted to maximize profits by controlling the work of their employees, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company didn't install any fire escapes. The one unlocked door was blocked by the fire. The factory had no sprinkler system, and the single fire escape had collapsed immediately because it hadn't been maintained by the company. Women were seen by people on the street jumping out of sixth-floor windows to their death on the streets below. Also, among the 146 women who died in this fire, Many were found huddled together with their faces around a small window, gasping for breath before they ultimately died from smoke. At the bottom of page 249, you will see the vocabulary for chapter 6.3. Please continue to make vocabulary cards